Well, I came out of West Virginia University as an ROT student, meaning a Reserve Officer Training Corps, and I was a second lieutenant, and I was transferred to Huntsville, Alabama, the Redstone Arsenal, and I was here for about 2 years as a lieutenant in the Army, and got to know the missile people. And lo and behold, Eisenhower decided to create something called NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And in fact, all of us, about 4,000 of us, basically left the Army and went to work for the space agency. And von Braun, of course, was the director. And we put together a program of about 4,000 guys and gals and started what's known today as the Marshall Space Flight Center. Almost immediately after that agency was established, President Kennedy declared, we're going to go to the moon, and we're going to go to the moon within this decade. And by the way, we're going to kick the Russians' butt in space. So that created a whole effort by the Marshall Center. And we were young. I think I was 26, 27 years old. And one of my jobs, primarily job, was handling the press. And in those days, we were just beginning to get into the Saturn program, that big rocket that made a lot of noise and got people's attention. And so once the president had made this commitment to go to the moon, we began to ground test our Saturn rockets. And my job was to take the press to the test site and bring them up close and watch the test firing. I had this one reporter from New York who came to see a test firing. And he set up his camera. He was going to record the entire test. And this was the closest that I had ever brought a newsman to the test stand. In fact, I was told by my boss, bring the guy as close as you can because we want to really impress him. So I did. We were about 2,000 yards away from the Saturn V test stand. And we were hooking up. And I began to explain to this reporter and photographer, look, we're very close to this machine, and when this goes off, you're going to see a lot of flame, you're going to feel a vibration, and you probably may want to go back further and get some shelter. And he said, young man, I've been all over the world. I've covered floods, I've covered tornadoes, wars. I think I can handle this little rocket engine firing. So we waited for all the bells and whistles to go off as they did in the test lab, warning everybody that we were about to fire. And sure enough, they turned that big Saturn V booster on. And for a few seconds, the flame just sort of hangs there, and all of a sudden, it just blows out. And the reporter not only knocked over his camera, but he ran across the cotton field and did not get 1 foot of footage of the Saturn V test stand, which I was able to go back and get some footage and give it to him. I never heard from him again. I don't know whether he ever used it or not, but I know that was an interesting experience for our reporter who came to see a Saturn V test firing. In those days, we were very active in the press, and one of the things that happened, we had all these laboratories. We had the test laboratory, computer laboratory, and we were designing, developing, creating, and testing rockets here. We were in the rocket business early on, and we were building big rockets with Saturn I, Saturn 1B, Saturn V, and that was a really exciting time because we would see lots of press people. They wanted to see von Braun, they wanted to interview von Braun, but they also wanted to see a Saturn V test firing. So that was a big deal for us to be a part of that and really launch the Saturn program, which eventually was the machine that launched our astronauts to the moon. I really think President Kennedy found something in us that we didn't know we had at the time. We had done missiles, we had done a lot of rockets with the missile Army people, but we had never really been challenged to do something like fly astronauts out of Earth orbit 240,000 miles away. And I think von Braun was the perfect person to be engaged in all of that because he had the vision that we didn't really have a feel for, at our level. And he was seeing the future way beyond us. And he put together one heck of a team of people to develop the rocket. And, you go down the hall to the water fountain. That's where all the major decisions were made, by the way, in those days, at the water fountain. And you would hear 4 words: Saturn, man, moon, decade. We had a passion about what we were challenged to do. And I think we began to realize that we were really going to do this. We were going to go to the moon. We were going to launch astronauts to the moon. We ended up launching 9 Saturn Vs to the moon, and 6 of those crews landed. And we did all that within a short period of time, 8 years. But I think at that time, we had the right people. We had the commitment of the President of the United States. We had the money, and we were turned loose to really make this happen. You didn't go home until you had finished your work. That was pretty standard in those days. Late to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and advertise. And we were committed to make it happen. And I think with the President's commitment, challenged us, and we were not only were we involved, but we had our partners at the Cape, and we had our partners at the Houston facility. So, and then Mississippi Test and Michoud all came together. And that was an unbelievable group of people that had the dream and had the commitment to make this thing happen. So I think it was a special time. And I think within that 8-year period, we accomplished what we set out to do. When I got here, there were about 50,000 people, and Huntsville was really a cotton town. We did have Redstone Arsenal. They had been in the ammunitions business and so forth. Then they got into the missile business. So for about 10 years, the institution called Redstone Arsenal grew from a small group of people to some very well-qualified, especially engineering people. So it was pretty sizable. Marshall came along and added roughly 7,000 people. So we went from the small southern town to something that was quite sizable and growing fast. And in fact, the city did grow fast. We enjoyed Huntsville when we first got here because it was a small town, and we felt like we were still back in our little hometown we grew up in. And eventually, though, it grew to become pretty substantial. And I think the city fathers did a good job of preparing the community for growth. And I think overall, we've been very fortunate to have a well-developed, well-controlled city that, we enjoy raising our families here, and we have great schools, and now we have colleges and so forth. So it's been an impressive view to see that community go from that 50,000 population to approaching well over 200,000, I take it, today. So yes, and it's still the Rocket City as far as I'm concerned. We really didn't have any connection with that situation in Montgomery. It was like we were so committed to the moon landing. Huntsville was kind of like a little separate community from the rest of the state. You had a lot of people that had moved in here from other locations in the country, and we were just not engaged with that. We invited Governor Wallace to come to the Marshall Center, and it was a big deal because Webb came to town. Von Braun, of course, was here, and they invited him to come. And he came to watch a Saturn I test firing. And he was just a perfect gentleman. I can assure you the staff meetings before that visit went long and strong because we were all nervous about the press was going to take over, create a situation that we would not want to embarrass Mr. Webb and certainly Warner von Braun because of the politicians coming to town. It turned out that Governor Wallace was he was a perfect gentleman. And it was a great relationship that developed between politics and the space program. He saw what we were doing, and he was extremely impressed. I don't think he had any idea the size of the Saturn rocket. He'd heard about missiles being fired and so forth, but we took him right up close to the booster, and he had a chance to see a ground test firing. Of course, von Braun was the master politician. He never had any problems dealing with people. He made you feel comfortable, and he believed it was important for us to connect with the state of Alabama and be a part of the government where we needed to participate or where we could help the state of Alabama. And we did that. Of course, one of the things that happened out of that was the state of Alabama built the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. Von Braun's idea, and he got Governor Wallace and others to support that, and that was paid for by the state of Alabama right here in Huntsville. Oh, he was one heck of a salesman. We didn't have to do much selling of the program when Warner was in town. I think he had that ability to communicate. And here's a rocket scientist that you would expect would be talking to you in technical terms and so forth. It didn't make any difference. Whoever was in the audience, Warner von Braun would connect. First of all, he believed in the team. He really did believe that we could make the landing within the decade. And a lot of us, I can tell you right now, didn't think we'd ever make the cut by '69. He was a great team manager. He knew his people so well that he could call up, and he would not necessarily just call the lab director. He might call a guy or a gal 3 or 4 levels down to get an answer to a question. So he was an unusual technical guy. Not only did he have tremendous technical skills, but when he sat down to be interviewed by a TV or a news reporter, the guy walked away tremendously impressed, and it was usable. It didn't sound like some technical guy that was trying to speak over your head. So he taught us all the fact that we needed to be able to tell our story, open up the gates. We had an unbelievable number of visitors. We were open for business. I'm telling you, a day would not go by that we didn't have all kinds of visitors coming, not only to see the Marshall Space Flight Center, but hopefully see a test firing, but for sure to go in one of the labs and see one of the boosters under development or under construction. So we were selling the thing all the time. And of course, von Braun was right out there helping us do that. And I think he believed that the American public, the taxpayer, deserved to know what was being done. And are we really going to go to the moon? Are we going to be successful? And he felt like we had an obligation to let the taxpayer know that this is your money, and we're going to use this money to go to the moon, and we're going to beat the Russians to the moon. So he was a perfect boss to have. And he would listen to us when we would advise him that we need to get some attention here. We need to take some people to the Cape for a launch. And we would do that. We would take leaders of the communities down to the Cape to see a launch. That was pretty popular in those days, to load them up in an airplane, go watch a firing and see a launch. So he was a PR man's dream as far as being able to deal with him and have him available to us, and when we needed him, to tell the story. He never wanted to waste time. He was the kind of guy that never took time to do this or do that. He was very much committed to making something happen. Even as he went water skiing and so forth, he wanted to make sure everybody was active, doing something. Somebody had a job, either driving the boat or floating on the deck or in the skis or doing something. He wanted to make sure everybody was engaged. Well, when Sputnik was launched, I was working on the West Virginia University newspaper that night. I was, in fact, in the slot, and we were putting the paper together, and a big machine in the back room started going off, all the bells ringing, and when you heard that, you thought there's a war or something going to happen, and sure enough, the announcement came out was The Russians have launched a Sputnik. Well, we thought it was a potato at first because we didn't know what Sputnik was. Nobody could spell it. So we called the professor, and he looked into it, and he said, yes, it's some kind of a device that they've launched in space. Well, we were asking, is it going to come down or what's going to happen? And, we were shocked that that happened. And then after I looked back and realized what happened, we actually had Explorer 1 ready to go before Sputnik. But consequently, the politics and so forth got all involved, and it was delayed. And we eventually launched it, and that really, I think, convinced all of us that we could do something with these rockets. And then the next thing you know, we launched Alan Shepard, May 5, 1961, first American to fly on a rocket. And I really believe that was the mission, that was the event that got everybody pumped up. We were challenged by the Russians. In fact, I think the Russians really kicked us in to the movement to make this thing happen. And we loved to beat them. In fact, every time we had a launch of an Apollo to the moon, we sent a newspaper clipping and a photograph to all the Russian newspapers and publications. We never heard a word. So, the Russian people really didn't know that there was a competition going on between the U.S. and us. Well, Saturn V launch was a major event. We would, about 6 of us would go there about 3 days before liftoff. And of course, the press, I think when we had Apollo 11, there were something like 1,000 members of the press certified to watch that launch. So we brought them in, and we took them on tours out to the launch site. They saw the vehicle on the pad, and we basically prepared them. Well, then we took them to the press site, and then we prepared them for the launch. And a lot of people had not experienced a Saturn I or anything that size. So the new press people were somewhat overwhelmed. Particularly that old Saturn V would come off the pad real slow. And I remember the first time I saw a Saturn V launch with the press people, one of the guys says, "It's coming back," which he thought it was coming back to the press site and not going out over the ocean. So it was kind of a common joke. Anytime we would fly one, somebody said, "Yeah, it's coming back again," But it was a major vehicle to watch. It was so slow coming off the pad, and then you got to see it for a long distance, especially when there was not any cloud cover. You got to watch that bird fly for a long time, and then on occasion you'd actually see staging at a certain time in the flight. But yes, no one ever grew tired of watching a Saturn V launch. It was something about that vehicle that stayed with you. Of course, the shuttle was fantastic because you saw it come off and turn and all. But the Saturn V, when you had crew members on board that thing, and we launched 9 of those crews beyond Earth orbit to the moon and back, and it was successful. Every one of those flights was successful. And I think that's the thing that sticks with me. We went through Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Saturn, moon rockets, all those flights, and we were very successful in accomplishing all those flights with those guys. And, when you send guys out of Earth orbit, beyond Earth orbit to the moon and back, you really accomplished something. And I don't think we appreciated at the time how competent the team was and how successful we were. I'm sure there was a lot of luck involved too, because things did happen, but those vehicles performed well, and we got all those astronauts back safely. And I think that's the thing about Apollo is I think you have to look at Apollo as being this is an example of a country leaving Earth orbit and doing something that's never been done before. And no other country has ever accomplished what we've done with the Saturn Apollo program. And those astronauts, they get a lot of credit. They're good old fighter pilots, and they just volunteered, and as as shepherds say, well, I'm going to fly on this rocket and I'll come back and fly another one. They were in touch with us, and they did acknowledge von Braun, and they appreciated the team, by the way, that put the Mercury together and put the Saturn program together. They really appreciated the fact that we had the rocket people here in Huntsville, Alabama, and we had a good marriage between the Houston people and the Saturn rocket people. He came to the Space and Rocket Center one day, and we were walking through the rocket park because we just put up one of the rockets, and we were cleaning it up, and there was a whole group of school children there, and they were walking through, and they had their sketches, books, and so forth, and they were taking notes. Teacher was with them, and he said to me, what's that group doing? And I said, well, that's a school group. We call it the Yellow School Bus Tour. They're here, and they'll probably spend most of the day, and then they'll be leaving and going back home. He says, do you think they get anything out of this visit? I said, yes, sir, I do. I believe they get excited about rocketry. They learn about rocketry. But I think they'd also like to climb in that spacecraft over there and slip on a spacesuit and maybe snack on space food while they're here. He looked at me and he looked at those youngsters. He says, we have all kinds of camps in this country. We need a science camp. And that was the beginning of what today is Space Camp. And Warner von Braun is the guy who brought Space Camp to Huntsville, Alabama. 700,000 children have experienced Space Camp. And that was a Warner von Braun idea. If we had not lost the President of the United States of that time, Kennedy, I think this team would have gone on to Mars, because that was von Braun's real long-range dream, is land astronauts on the surface of Mars. He had the nuclear engine for the third stage of the Saturn V already developed. I did not get to see that, but many of my friends did see that nuclear rocket engine tested. And that thing was going to be ready to go by the end of the 60s and early 70s. So the team was in place, and the spirit was there, and especially after we landed on the moon. The next step was Mars.